Marcus stood in the empty lot, his hands trembling as he clutched the rental agreement. The address was correct, 647 Maple Street, apartment 3B. But where his building should have been, only weeds and broken concrete remained. His phone showed no signal, no GPS recognition of the location. It was as if the place had been erased from existence itself. Just 12 hours earlier, he'd been inside that very apartment, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, feeling the weight of the floorboards beneath his feet. The walls had been real. He'd touched them, painted them. The neighbors had been real. Mrs. Chen from 3A had brought him homemade cookies. But now, standing in this vacant lot under the harsh afternoon sun, Marcus felt reality slipping through his fingers like sand. The most terrifying part wasn't that the building had vanished. It was the growing certainty that everyone else had forgotten it ever existed, everyone except him. And as the sun began to set, Marcus realized he had a choice to make: accept that he was losing his mind, or return to a place that shouldn't exist. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been desperate. His divorce had left him financially drained, emotionally shattered, and searching for the cheapest apartment he could find. The listing for 647 Maple Street had appeared on his screen like a miracle. Fully furnished, utilities included, rent so low it seemed almost insulting to the landlord. When he'd called the number, a woman's voice had been warm, almost maternal. "Oh, you're exactly what we've been looking for," she'd said. "When can you move in?" The building had looked ordinary enough from the outside: red brick, fire escapes zigzagging up the facade, the kind of place that housed teachers and social workers and people just trying to make ends meet. But as Marcus climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, he'd noticed something odd. The hallways were too quiet. Not just empty quiet, but vacuum quiet, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the walls. He'd knocked on 3A, Mrs. Chen's door, and heard shuffling inside, but when she opened it, her eyes had seemed to look right through him before suddenly focusing, as if she was remembering who he was supposed to be. The first few nights had been blissful. Marcus had slept better than he had in months, wrapped in a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. The apartment itself seemed to breathe around him, walls that creaked in rhythm with his heartbeat, floorboards that warmed under his bare feet, windows that perfectly framed the sunset no matter what time of day he looked through them. He'd started working from home, taking freelance graphic design jobs, rarely leaving except for groceries and the occasional walk. It was during one of these walks that he'd first noticed the inconsistency. He'd gone to the corner store, bought milk and bread, and when he'd turned to walk back, he'd had to stop and think, which way was home? The streets looked familiar but wrong, like a photograph that had been subtly altered. He'd pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but the map showed only a blank space where his building should have been. Panic had started to rise in his throat, but then he'd turned a corner, and there it was, 647 Maple Street, exactly where it should have been, as if it had been waiting for him to find it. Marcus had convinced himself it was stress. The divorce, the job loss, the medication he'd been prescribed for anxiety. All of it could explain the confusion, the spatial disorientation. But the incidents began to multiply. Delivery drivers would call him frustrated and lost, claiming the address didn't exist. His internet searches for local businesses near his apartment returned results for a neighborhood 3 miles away. When he tried to give his new address to his lawyer, the man looked at him strangely and said, "Marcus, that's just an empty lot. Has been for 15 years. The most disturbing incident came when his sister visited. She had stood in the lobby, looking around with obvious confusion. "This is quaint," she'd said, but her voice had carried a strange quality, as if she was reading from a script she didn't quite understand. During dinner, she had asked him 3 times what floor he lived on, and each time she'd seemed genuinely surprised by his answer. When she had left, Marcus had watched him from his window as she walked to her car, then stopped, looking around as if she'd forgotten where she was. She had called him an hour later, asking if he was okay, and mentioning that she'd had the strangest dream about visiting him in some old building. The psychological thriller began to deepen when Marcus started documenting everything. He'd take photos of the building, the hallways, his neighbors, but every time he left the apartment, the photos would become corrupted. Or worse, they'd show empty lots, vacant rooms, people who weren't quite right. Mrs. Chen would appear in one photo as an old, kindly woman, but in another, taken just minutes later, she'd be a young man in his 30s with no memory of ever making cookies. Marcus realized he was living in a bubble of constructed reality, one that only existed when he was physically present to observe it. The apartment building was like a stage set that only materialized when the actor stepped onto it. But this raised a terrifying question. If the building only existed when he was inside it, what did that make him? Was he the observer creating the reality, or was he a character in someone else's twisted story? The answer came when he found the journal hidden beneath his mattress. A journal written in his handwriting, describing events he had no memory of experiencing, plans he had never made, and a growing obsession with a woman named Sarah who lived in apartment 2C. A woman he was certain he'd never met. According to the journal, Sarah was why he'd moved to the building. Page after page detailed their relationship, conversations in the hallway, shared meals, intimate moments that felt both foreign and deeply familiar as he read them. The handwriting was definitely his, but the voice was that of a stranger, someone confident and charming where he remembered being broken and desperate. The final entry, dated just a week ago, was the most disturbing. She's starting to remember. The reset isn't working as well as it used to. I need to be more careful, or she'll realize what I've done. He had no memory of writing any of it, but when he looked around his apartment with fresh eyes, he began to notice things. Women's clothing mixed in with his own, a toothbrush he didn't recognize, photos on his phone of himself with a beautiful dark-haired woman, both of them smiling in locations he'd never visited. The unreliable narrator he'd become in his own story was starting to fracture, revealing glimpses of a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. That night he'd heard crying through the walls, soft, desperate sobbing that seemed to come from apartment 2C. When he'd pressed his ear to the shared wall, he'd heard a woman's voice whisper, "Please, just let me go home." The next morning, Marcus had stood outside apartment 2C for nearly an hour, his hand raised to knock, but unable to complete the gesture. What would he say? What would he find? The journal suggested a relationship he didn't remember, but the crying suggested something far more sinister. When the door had finally opened, it wasn't Sarah who greeted him, but Mrs. Chen, except she was younger now, with Sarah's dark hair and frightened eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice carrying traces of both women. "The building isn't ready for visitors yet." That's when Marcus understood the mind-bending story he'd become trapped in. The building wasn't just appearing and disappearing, it was cycling through different versions of itself, different combinations of residents, different possibilities. He wasn't just forgetting the building when he left, he was forgetting himself, forgetting the choices he'd made, the lines he'd crossed. The apartment existed only when he was inside it, because he was its anchor, its constant, the only element that remained stable while everything else shifted around him. But stable was a relative term. Looking at Mrs. Chen's face, seeing Sarah's eyes staring back at him in terror, Marcus realized that even he was changing with each cycle, becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of things he couldn't remember but couldn't deny. The plot twist came when Marcus found the basement. He'd never seen stairs leading down from the lobby, but there they were, as if they'd always existed. The basement was filled with screens, dozens of them, each showing different versions of the building, different timelines, different possibilities. On one screen, he saw himself as a successful architect who'd designed the building. On another, he was a patient in a psychiatric hospital, drawing floor plans on the walls of his padded cell. On a third, he was a predator who had lured Sarah to the building under false pretenses. But the most disturbing screen showed the truth. Marcus wasn't the protagonist of this story, he was the antagonist. The real Marcus had died in a car accident 6 months ago, and what remained was a ghost, a fragment of consciousness trapped in a loop of guilt and desire. The building was his purgatory, a place where he could play out endless scenarios, trying to find one where he was the hero instead of the villain. Sarah had been his therapist. She'd been trying to help him process his guilt over the accident, but instead, he'd become obsessed with her. The building was his mind's way of trapping her, of creating a world where she couldn't leave, where she had to stay and help him, had to love him, had to forgive him for what he'd done.
The dark secrets of his true nature began to unravel as Marcus climbed back upstairs. Each floor revealed new horrors, apartments filled with versions of Sarah, all of them trapped, all of them trying to escape, all of them slowly forgetting who they'd been before. The building was a prison of his own making, and he was both the warden and the most dangerous inmate. But knowing the truth didn't set him free. If anything, it made the prison stronger. Now he understood why the building disappeared when he left. It was his guilt that manifested it, his need to hide from the consequences of his actions. The outside world was real, but it was a world where he was dead, where Sarah had moved on, where his crimes had consequences. The mystery unraveled further when he realized that every time he left the building, he forgot not just the building, but his crimes. He became innocent again, genuinely confused and lost, truly believing he was a victim of strange circumstances. The cycles were his mind's way of protecting itself, of maintaining the illusion that he was still a good person, still deserving of love and forgiveness. Standing in that empty lot, Marcus finally understood his choice. He could stay outside, accept reality, and fade away as the ghost he'd become. Or he could return to the building, return to the cycle, return to a world where he could pretend to be innocent while continuing to torment the one person who'd tried to help him. The sun was setting as he made his decision. He walked back to where the building should be, closed his eyes, and stepped forward. The ground solidified beneath his feet, walls materialized around him, and the familiar silence of his apartment building welcomed him home. But this time he remembered. This time he knew what he was choosing. As he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, he heard Sarah crying again. But now he also heard something else. His own voice comforting her, promising her that everything would be all right, that he would help her find her way home. The psychological thriller had become a loop of eternal punishment, and Marcus had become both its victim and its perpetrator, forever trapped in a building that existed only in the space between guilt and denial, between memory and forgetting. As Marcus disappeared into his self-made prison, one question haunts us. Was he truly a ghost trapped by guilt? Or was he a living man who'd created the perfect hiding place for his crimes? The beauty of this twisted story lies in its ambiguity. The unreliable narrator has left us with fragments of truth, forcing us to piece together the real horror hidden beneath layers of self-deception. What do you think really happened to Marcus? Was the building a supernatural manifestation of his guilt? Or was it a psychological break that allowed him to escape the consequences of his actions? Share your theories in the comments below. I love hearing how these mind-bending stories affect each of you differently. If this psychological thriller left you questioning the nature of reality and memory, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake at night. We dive deep into the darkest corners of the human psyche every week, exploring the thin line between sanity and madness, between victim and perpetrator. Till next time, stay kind, stay sharp, and stay curious.